So here you see a map of Europe during the High Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages obviously is an incredibly long period of time. You're really talking about 1,000 years of history, generally from the fall of the Roman Empire, which is typically dated at the end of the 400s. 476 is often the date given for the collapse of the Roman Empire, at least in the West. The Middle Ages is a period from the end of the Roman Empire in the West, which would have dominated this area here and surrounding the Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire was a remnant of the Roman Empire that continued to exist. But it's 1,000-year history, and it's broken up into really three sort of periods. The first period is the early Middle Ages, and that goes from the 5th century. So when you say 5th century, 400s, Common Era, so AD, 400s till about 1000. And then the High Middle Ages is the period from around about the 11th century, around 1000, till, the end of the 1300s or the middle of the 1300s. And then the late Middle Ages would be the middle of the 1300s until the end of the 1400s, roughly. This is a massively long period of time. It's very difficult to characterize it in like broad generalities because there's so many different developments that occur. This is a map of Europe during the High Middle Ages, and just by looking at this, and by the way, the reason it's called the High Middle Ages, and that's the period in the middle, is because that's the period that's associated with really the most significant development in Europe during the Middle Ages. Developments associated with farming, technology, education, town and city development, trade, economics, and these types of things. You can see by looking at this map, the geopolitical map of Europe is very, very different. You don't see any country on this map except for maybe England that really looks anything like you imagine the political map of Europe to look today. Of course, as you know it, a singular country of France doesn't really exist, though the royal domain, where the modern country of France kind of extends out of, is right here. All in brown here is the so-called Holy Roman Empire. And this was the domain that was really ruled by the monarch that was in the stay of the papacy down here in the papal states around Rome. And of course, the Holy Roman Empire was created under the monarchy of Charlemagne during the 8th century, really, the 800s, the early 800s. Was when that was really created. And it was designed to be this large Central European loose empire that was designed to expand and maintain the domains of the Catholic Church of Christendom. What drives historical change? Okay, what results, for example, in a fundamental recreation of the map of Europe, or in the development of societies in Europe, or in changes of religion, and so forth? What drives historical change? There's a lot of good choices out there, right? Some folks said technology, technological development, warfare. Other people said, new ideas, research, science, right? Ideologies, religious development. Those are all very significant factors in bringing about historical change. However, when we study world history, when we study about change in the world, probably one idea, which kind of encompasses all of those other items that you pointed out, that kind of encompasses all of it, that drives change, is a term called interconnectivity. You might call it global interconnectivity. What do we mean by that? We mean connections between societies and people. All modern societies are the result of different peoples, animals, ideas, and so forth coming together and reconstructing the world. Consider this. Western Europe, as we will talk about, during the High Middle Ages was dominated by the political authority of the Catholic Church. Well, the Catholic Church was actually originally born in the Roman Empire. It was a product largely of the Mediterranean, right? And all of Western Europe, the areas that are parts of Germany and France, those would have been controlled by Germanic peoples that practiced, animistic pagan religions. But the interconnections of those people and their ideas with Roman ideas and Catholic ideas reconstructs, what the political and religious world of Europe looks like during the Middle Ages. Think about this. A lot of people said technology. I know that some of you were thinking technological developments like the printing press, for example. Well, the printing press was originally developed in China, movable type printing. And through long distance trade and exchanges from people, that technology was refined in Europe. But Europeans didn't invent it out of nowhere, right? They refined it and applied it to their own printing technology. Sometimes when people think about technological change and forces driving historical change, they say, gunpowder weapons, for example, military technologies. Well, gunpowder also comes from China. So does the technology of paper comes from China. And these technologies used or were exchanged through trade routes over a long period of time, often exchanging from warfare between Islamic empires and Chinese empires. These technologies sometimes were exchanged, leading to the expansion of gunpowder weapons through much of the world, India, the Mideast, and up into Europe. So technological change is it's an important development when it comes to historical change, but it's connected to a larger force driving historical change, and that is the constant interconnections of the world. Global interconnectivity brings about historical change. It is kind of encompassing all aspects of change in society. And so that is an important lesson. I think it's really significant to consider this and to remember this, because none of the major changes during the Middle-Aged period, for example, came about by societies that were completely isolated. Instead, they came through voluntary or involuntary exchanges, whether war, whether people traveling. It is the coming together of different cultures, of different societies, of ideas, of technology, and so forth. And of course, some of it can be very unintended. The Black Death. We'll talk about the Black Death. The Black Death, of course, came from Asia. The Black Death was a product of the interconnections of the world. Sometimes when examining the Middle Ages, there's this idea that the Middle Age period was this period in which all these isolated little kingdoms had no real connection with the rest of the world. But in reality, the world, with the exception of the Americas, because the Americas had yet to be incorporated at that time, but the world at that time was all interconnected. Even though you couldn't get on an airplane and fly to, Asia, doesn't mean there weren't trade routes over land and by sea that connected Western European societies with Middle Eastern societies, Indian societies, Asian societies, African societies. They were all connected. And it was through those interconnections that much of the most significant forces of historical change occurred. So interconnectivity could be a question on a test. Global interconnectivity in the world is really the driving force, the vehicle of world historical change. And all the smaller things, technology, changes in ideas, these types of things are often reliant on those connections that bring new ideas, that bring new animals, that bring new technologies, and so forth, that are then refined upon by other peoples. Oftentimes, the Middle Ages, this 1,000-year period, is viewed and defined as a dark age. And the term a dark age, I think, sometimes is meant to connotate the idea that nothing of great significance happened during the Dark Ages or during the Middle Ages, that it was a period of stagnation, no major change happening. And instead, it was a period where the world sort of fell into a stagnant, unchanging, and sort of miserable reality for 1,000 years. Of course, we know that that change derives to a large degree from the perceptions of individuals from the Renaissance and beyond who defined that period of time. And it should be noted that when you look at the Middle Ages, there are some arguments to suggest that you might say it's a dark age, because it's not a time of great prosperity. I mean, during the early Middle Ages, from roughly 500 to roughly 1,000 CE or AD, there's really no economy in Western Europe. Like, there's no, like, we talk about money today, and there's stimulus packages, and people print money, and you work for money, and seemingly everybody seeks out this money so you can go and buy things or do things and consume things. During the early Middle Ages, there's really no real economy to speak of. Even like lords did not have bunches of money lying around. And in fact, well, it was actually like, robbers and people that would pillage, travelers. That was one of the most foremost ways that people got money if they weren't an aristocrat or a monarch during this period of time. There's really almost no road system. There's no public education. So any kind of traveling at the time was incredibly difficult. And only like the most well protected and most advanced sort of lord or monarch would be able to travel much in Europe. Even in the high Middle Ages, so this is the peak of the European Middle Ages, in places like England, the lifespan of an adult male was average of 31 years, very young. Now that doesn't mean that's an average, of course, and there were people that lived much, much longer than that. But many people died in childbirth. Many women died in childbirth. Many babies died, and it was a particularly difficult time to live. And people, suffered from diseases and maladies and infections that today would be easily something you would get through and you would live. But at this time, where you have really no advanced medicine, you have no hospitals, you have nothing like that. The way of living, particularly for people that were in the peasant classes, the masses of people, was particularly difficult. There's no freedom of thought or freedom of expression. Resistance to a monarchy or a monarch during the Middle Ages, would be punished. There would not be fair trials per se. They would oftentimes result in extreme forms of punishment. People were not educated. Only about 2% of the populace during the Middle Ages was actually literate. And those portions of the population were actually all from the religious world, the monks in the Catholic Church, for example. And they did all of the transcribing of books like the Bible. And people couldn't read. There was no mass education industry. There was no libraries with books that you could go and read. Any kind of collection of such works would have been controlled by the church, and the vast majority of people, even monarchs in some cases, could not read. King Charlemagne, the monarch of the High Middle Ages or the early Middle Ages, who's associated with the founding of the Holy Roman Empire, which I showed you on the map earlier, he's one of the most significant monarchs of the entirety of the Middle Ages, and he himself was illiterate. Though he loved learning and he promoted education and he wanted people to read, and his people transcribed many, many Roman documents. But education is not widespread. There's continual warfare during the Middle Ages. There are persecutions. There are persecutions against Jewish people. There are persecutions against people that are Christians but considered heretics. There are persecutions against Muslim people. There's continual warfare, persecutions against individuals that wish not to be incorporated in a larger kingdom. So in that sense, the Middle Ages is a time which is very difficult for many people to live in. There's not a lot of money, there's not a lot of opportunity, there's not a lot of education. And generally speaking, conditions are quite bleak. In the early Middle Ages, there were actually really no major cities to speak of. Now, that doesn't mean that the Middle Ages should be considered a dark age necessarily. Because again, a dark age seems to imply that nothing important happened during the time period, when the reality is that the Middle Ages set the stage for the emergence of modern Europe, even though it's 1,000 years of history that at times looks rather bleak. The reality is that without the Middle Ages, the Renaissance and the emergence of modernity in Europe would not happen. Why? Because it's actually during the High Middle Ages, the period we're particularly going to talk about, where you see the development of the first universities. Oxford University, the University of Paris, for example. You see the first development of towns and cities during this period of time, where people start becoming involved in trade communities and in certain types of industries, like the textile industry. The city of Ghent, Belgium, was involved in the cloth-making industry. And that city was involved in trade from southern England throughout France. And that trade created a livelihood for people and allowed them to not only dwell within a walled, fortified town or city, but also allowed them to develop a certain level of economy that increased the living standard, if marginally, for people. The first parliaments were established, the roots of representative government. While representative government, the idea that we have today, that the citizens have a right to have their voice heard and have a say in their government, while representative government as we know it today does not exist in the Middle Ages, the roots of it were established during the Middle Ages. In many respects, your modern countries in some cases were born, at least the roots of those modern countries. And we're going to talk about one of them. Some of your most important economic and legal structures are born during the Middle Ages. The pound system, now today, the English pound, right, the British currency. Now today, the pound system of currency is actually, it's different. It's on a decimal system, so in that sense, it's kind of like any other sort of modern monetary system. But until the mid to later 20th century, Great Britain was in fact on a variation of the pound system as it emerged in the Middle Ages, actually the early Middle Ages. An example of an economic system that in one way or another had lasted a millennia. Basic writing form developed during the Middle Ages. Your textbook is actually loosely structured around the basic principles of grammar and punctuation that were established by the literate individuals of King Charlemagne's court during the early Middle Ages. Charlemagne, of course, himself, as I said, was illiterate. This is the Holy Roman Emperor, 800 AD or CE. But Charlemagne called on thinkers from all around the realm, as well as individuals in the Catholic Church, to copy documents and to develop some kind of educational system. And those individuals actually transcribed a tremendous amount of Roman documents. And it was those Roman documents that thinkers from the Renaissance were actually reading. The majority of Roman documents were transcribed during the Middle Ages. The way Romans used to write Latin is everything would run together in the Roman Latin. There was no space between the ends of sentences, if you will. The ends of sentences didn't really exist. It all ran together. It's incredibly difficult for even today for a scholar who specializes in Roman Latin, Roman documents. It's difficult to read. And so Charlemagne's court took that and they put basic sentence punctuation structures, paragraph breaks, and these types of things that made it more easy to read and decipher. these documents. And so in that sense, even the Renaissance owes itself to things that were transcribed by the court of Charlemagne and other middle-aged thinkers as they transcribed many of these documents.